Hello and welcome to the PTA Global webinar series. Thank you very much for joining us. It's a real honor and a pleasure to be here with PTA Global contributor and a great friend, an icon in our industry, Mr. Anthony Carey.
Great to be here. Thank you for having me, Dan.
Yeah, we're gonna have some fun here. Now, before we start having fun, just some quick housekeeping, because if you haven't tuned into one of our webinars in the past, or it's a little different from others that you've done in the past, just a few things. Number one, everybody is muted. Okay, so we just so to avoid all the background noise, right? That inevitably seems to happen. The other thing is time. You know, how long? What should you expect here? We're going to probably run a total of about 45 minutes, somewhere in there. But the idea is to do some interview and then to do some Q&A, because we want to hear from you. What you want to learn is more important than what we want to teach, because we're not addressing what you're here for. So if you have a question or you want some clarification, put it in the question box, not the chat box, but the question box, and I'll be monitoring that the entire time. Okay, so make sure you put your questions in there or any comments, and I'll be watching that. There are some downloads, so if you go to the handout window in your control panel, you can take those handouts down. It might open a separate window in your browser. Don't worry about it. It's not kicking you out of the webinar. You'll be able to come right back into it. Something else to know is if you're on a phone, if you have, sometimes depending on if you're seeing the screen that's the background or the camera with Anthony and I, if you only can see one, you can just swipe and it'll toggle between the two. Here's the important part: there's no exam. Okay, there's no exam. It's just a webinar. Now, if you take a course, of course, where there's CECs and you have exams, there are no CECs for this. It's an informational webinar, and we thank you very much for joining. So now that I got the housekeeping out of the way, let's get to the meat of this meal. And again, Anthony Carey, it's such a pleasure to have Anthony joining us. And I want to, I would not do I would do a disservice if I tried to introduce Anthony, so I'm going to let him do that. If you could tell us a little bit about yourself and your history in the industry, Anthony.
Well, it's been quite a few years actually, and I started with my introduction into the industry, believe it or not, in the late '80s. In New Jersey, where I was originally going, went for my undergraduate and started more in the corporate fitness side of things. Came to San Diego in 1991 for graduate school and got my graduate degree in biomechanics. Obviously been very involved in our industry and watched the evolution of it over the years. But I've never had the traditional role, except at the very beginning, of what people have long thought of what a personal trainer is. I've really been more on that sort of corrective chronic pain side of things for years. Probably in the late '90s, actually, I got involved in teaching and teaching workshops and seminars, and then started presenting at the conferences and all that. I've had the absolute honor and privilege of speaking in a lot of, just like yourself, in a lot of different places and meeting a lot of amazing professionals who are really making a contribution, and have had the good fortune to watch how the industry has evolved and the types of people that are accessing our services and how we've become a little bit more accessible. Since it used, like when I first started, literally it was like a Hollywood thing. Only Hollywood people, movie stars had personal trainers, and now we know what a valuable role we play. And for me, it's always been, what can my reach be like? Has been a big part of it. So teaching was one of those aspects, as was writing. Got a couple books out over the years, and then developing products. The Cortex and the soon-to-release Cortex Sit are ways that I feel like I can just exponentially touch more lives through my own personal mission and core values of what I want to be able to contribute to the industry and to the consumer as well. So I'm not done yet. I'm a continuous student who wants to get better and learn more. And the opportunity to speak with people like yourself and those that are on the call or the webinar, I'm grateful for their time.
Excellent, thank you, Anthony. A little side story here, and I think I've shared this with you, Anthony, on a call in recent past, but the first time that I actually talked to Anthony briefly was at an idea conference. He was presenting a session that involved movement. And I was a participant, and I don't even know if I was working for PTA Global yet. I think I was doing some contracting or something like that, and I knew that he was one of our contributors. And it was when a year, and I think they've done it ever since, that they gave it a medal for participation medal, and I forget what it's called. And every year they kind of give it a different theme. And he called my name. And I got a medal, and it was my first medal at these conferences. It's actually right behind me. I hung it up yesterday.
I remember
just
that.
moved.
I remember that.
Yeah, I was so honored. It just blew me away. I was like, oh my gosh, I just got a medal from Anthony Carey. So there's a little story to throw in while we're at it. And by the way, I have the Cortex right next to me, also just out of camera reach. Now,
boy.
somewhere around 2009, 2010, Anthony, you were approached or asked, or how did you get involved with contributing education to PTA Global?
Well, very good friends with Richard Boyd, who actually founded the whole thing, and then his nucleus of people I was actually at the first dinner that Richard on butcher paper mapped it all out of what he wanted to do, and I was there with Michelle Dalcourt and Bobby Capuccio, and Justin Price was there, I think, as well. And he really showed the vision at that point. And at the time, I was tied up in a lot of things, so I became one of the tracks, so to speak, of the contributing content, and again, more along my area of expertise. And it was amazing, because prior to that, I've been involved with PT on the Net since probably 2003 or 2004, where I first started writing and got that exposure. That's how I met Richard. Richard introduced me to Michelle, and then the family just grew from there. And when those guys were living in San Diego, I got to know them even better and become much more involved in this. And San Diego's where a lot of the PTA Global first mentorships, et cetera, all started. So I had the privilege of interacting with a lot of the early adopters, so to speak, and be around when a lot of that was happening. So it was a lot of fun.
Excellent. And I've often said I wish I could have been a fly on that wall at that first dinner that you're talking about. Now, we've been doing these webinars. We're trying to do them every week. We're only inviting people like yourself that have 20 plus years of experience in the industry, have truly made a place for yourself in the profession, and helped others develop themselves as we develop ourselves in the process, right? And the question that I always like to ask for our listeners out there, which we know come from varying levels of experience or time in the industry, but I think we all could benefit from hearing your opinion on when you started 20, 25 years ago. There were probably traits or characteristics or body of knowledge or something that a trainer, a coach needed to possess to truly be successful 20, 25 years ago. Now, looking at the present, what traits, characteristics, bodies of knowledge, what are the things that you see are absolutely still consistent and most important?
Well, going back to the beginning, the idea was definitely, I think, education, right? And there were no certifications actually really back then. Going back 25 years ago, it was basically you had to have a degree, or else you were somebody that just was in good shape, and other people came to you. There was like two ends of the spectrum. There was no career path built out like that. The people that were training, that were bodybuilders or athletes that were just training people, really had no desire to get a degree at that point. And those of us that came out with an academic background were also a little bit raw on the rest of the skill set, the soft skills that really make good personal trainers. But without question, understanding the human body, and rapport building and that sort of stuff. I would suggest one of the things that really made the difference. So if you walked in there with academic credentials, that gave you a certain level of influence when you went in. If you didn't have the academic credentials and you were still working with people, it was your confidence, right? So you would get confidence indirectly by having your academic background. by default, because you're like, hey, I have the science behind this. The other side of the spectrum, those folks that were training people had confidence, right? And as maybe as simplified as that seems, it's something today, even when I teach, even people that come to our mentorships for the pain-free movement specialist, I can see the lack of confidence initially in them that is definitely handicaps their ability to really impact people the way they want to impact people and expand their reach the way they want to expand their reach. So there's no question that the ability and that confidence doesn't have to mean that you have a PhD in exercise physiology, right? I mean, sometimes confidence comes from staying in your lane and being really good. One of my favorite perspectives that I've talked about for years is I think it's a lot of value for our industry to run our niche deep and not wide. At the beginning, you start really wide because you're looking to see what do I like, as well as who do I resonate with, who I train. But if you're trying to be the jack of all trades to every single person that comes through your door for the rest of your career, you're always going to be competing on price, for one thing. You're not really going to develop an in-depth knowledge, but you might be happy with the variety and all that. So there's nothing wrong with that. But I think if you really want to become sort of the go-to person in your area or in your gym or within the community, is get deep, not wide.
Excellent. So kind of to summarize, confidence, education, and for lack of a better word, specialization, but something, a pathway that you've narrowed down that you're going to continue to evolve in and become better at and be known for.
Yeah,
I love that.
And Dan, you use the term, and we use it now, coaching. But in the 25, 30 years ago, coaches were sporting coaches and trainers were trainers, right? And part of what has evolved, obviously, that maybe people new to the industry don't know is the vast number of areas that we seek to impact people's health and well-being, right? And hence the change in how we identify ourselves at times to coaches from trainers. And with that, it opens up a whole nother level of skill sets and qualities that an individual can have. Because, for example, if I started my career today and was just working and just sought to work with the corrective and chronic pain person, I wouldn't be taking nutrition classes per se. I'd be looking more on the coaching and the psychological and the motivations and all that kind of stuff, and because that's really what makes a big difference in the chronic pain client. And nutrition is important, obviously, but where it falls in the hierarchy of what's most important, and that becomes unique to all of us in the industry, is that we have that opportunity to kind of say, wow, here's a much larger perspective of how our field can play a role in health and well-being, and I really like that, and I really think I excel at that. So I'm gonna gravitate a little bit more in that direction in terms of what I study, who I listen to, seminars I take, all that kind of stuff.
Great stuff. And, we had an interview with co-founder Ian O'Dwyer last month, or just over a month ago, and he said, trainers train animals and coaches train people. And I really like that. Of course, he started out training horses, so that was very relevant.
Right. Ian's brilliant.
Taking everything that you just described about what makes a fitness professional, a coach, a trainer successful now, what made them successful in the past. What about the future? As we look forward, and we've had a real curveball, I think we can all agree, in 2020, and seen a lot of changes in the last few months with the COVID pandemic.
Yeah.
So maybe considering that, maybe not, in your professional opinion, moving forward, looking forward, maybe somebody just starting out, or somebody willing to sidestep and pivot and make some adjustments or make some additions in their business so they can, rock it for the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. What traits, characteristics, education, et cetera, would you say is going to be just crucial for them moving forward?
Well, I think it's past, present, and future on this one. Is I've always been a huge student of personal growth, right? And Bobby Cappuccio would be a great example of the content that goes along with that, right? But you could be academically, you could be the brightest person in the room with the highest IQ, and if you lack confidence, if you lack the ability to empathy, communication skills, all those kind of things. Goal setting, what motivates you, all that kind of stuff is a big part of it. So as a subset to that, of something that I've also always been a big believer in is, figuring out multiple ways that not only can I contribute, but that I can also provide for my family, right? So if the only thing that I ever did was work with clients, and the types of clients that I work with, and that was shut down, which has happened to so many people right now, then my income stream dries up, right? But if I figure out other ways that I can expand my reach, not just the obvious, which was going online for so many people, but there are other ways that you can expand your reach. Is I think that having that entrepreneurial mindset is an advantage to all of us, right? And you often hear people in our field, trainers, coaches, who are so passionate about the science and helping people that they forget about the opportunities that come and other things that we can do with our lives with the appropriate financial resources as well, right? So I think that between having at least some interest in personal growth, how can I go to work on me before I go to work on you? And then understanding a little bit of an entrepreneurial mindset is going to give you a safety net, for that matter, in how you're able to protect what is yours in hard times, which we all have hit those at different times, and different ways. And at the same time, you might figure out that there's better ways to leverage your time as you do that. And there's nothing wrong. There's absolutely nothing wrong with a fitness professional making a lot of money. Okay, the helping people and being poor are not necessarily, do not have to go together. You don't have to do that. You can be aggressively entrepreneurial and still serving with values and with the best interest of those you're helping, right? And I think that's something that we sometimes forget about, because we're so wrapped up in sort of the holiness of being amazing coaches and trainers.
Great advice. And I'm gonna. I hope nobody else is hearing this echo that I just heard, but I'm going to take a little leap here, because by the end of this interview, I'm sure Anthony, if he doesn't, I'm going to ask him to tell you more about the Cortex, which is a product that he developed when we're talking about that entrepreneurial spirit or skill set. And what we just experienced over the last 3 months, what happened, right? We had to shut down business. We had to shut down brick and mortar. We could no longer see people. And the sales of fitness equipment went through the roof because everybody was training at home. And I'm sharing this because you posted it, Anthony, but he sold out, which is a really good problem to have when you're selling fitness equipment. So, maybe your clientele or your patients' visits are going down, but if you have another revenue stream, to your point, and I'm sure that's exactly what you're speaking to, you have a backup plan, and that one worked out really well. And I mean, in our case, we deliver a lot of online education, and suddenly people couldn't, come together. So workshops were shut down, but a lot of people were learning online. So having that ability to think through, well, what are some of the, things that I can do if I hit hard times is great advice.
Yeah. And real quick, just one other thing is, if your schedule's lighter right now, which it may be, and not just scrambling to figure out ways to make, but this is really a great time to try to hone your operations, right? What are the things that I can do better within my business, even if I'm a solopreneur, what can I do better? How can I outline my systems better? And when I get back and I'm working with clients, I have all that already ready to go, right? So use that downtime. In improving what you haven't probably paid attention to in months or years, for that matter, documentation, your follow-up, your referral systems, all those things are things that are worth spending some time on right now when your schedule's light.
Great advice. Great advice. So we're gonna jump off in this discussion and jump into one of the topics, one of the subjects that Anthony's so well versed at, and what we invited him to speak on, because he's been doing some education recently on cuing. But before I start with some questions, I want to remind everybody that if you have a question, please put it in the question panel, because we want to make sure, and again, address anything that comes to mind. Put it in there, and we'll make sure and get to them at the end. Okay. Now, jumping into the topic of cueing, I personally watched a presentation that Anthony did recently, and there were a few things that stood out that I wanted to make sure that we talked about today, because it's a little less shorter time frame. And you had a slide, Anthony, in your presentation, and there was a quote on there, and it said, "Never train the right way to be the best." And just reading that on its face, it sounds kind of counterintuitive. Can you talk a little bit more about what that means and how it applies to what you're sharing?
Sure. That really applies to the idea of what's called differential learning, which is that mistakes are opportunities, right? So when we see clients making errors, movement errors in execution of something, it's really an opportunity for their motor system to figure out some solutions. What can they have in the bank to call upon when something goes wrong, right? So in other words, if you use the analogy, or the comparison, I should say, of a selectorized piece of equipment, right? Good, bad, or indifferent, it does what it does, and there's very little variability in that. So if I took a person and had them do a seated chest press on a selectorized piece of equipment, and then they got very good and very strong at that, you put them on a bench press, or even a dumbbell press for that matter, and we looked at the EMG, and we looked at the sort of the kinematics of how the joints move, they still might be moving. There'd be all kinds of variation in that. And that's because their system is figuring out ways to solve that problem. So if we're overly judicious in the way that we ask somebody to do things, and don't allow them to just be as they figure it out, so we overcoach sometimes, right? We don't give them the opportunity to allow their bodies to figure it out. And instead, we're overloading them with verbal cues that in the end is just actually frustrating them and leading to some inauthenticity in the way that they move.
I love that. And speaking from experience, because if there's I don't want to say mistake, but a lot of them were mistakes. If there's one to be made, I've made it. And what I definitely started out doing, and what I see a lot of coaches doing, is exactly that: over cueing, a lot of detail, a lot of attention to certain parts of the body, which I'm sure we're going to speak to. And I think the reason, I know speaking for myself, is I felt like that's what they wanted to hear, that it helped bolster my, their perception of my level of expertise.
Right.
And
right.
I think that's one of the most common reasons. Would you agree that we overcoach, is we want them to see value in our knowledge, when the reality is that's not really what they're looking for?
Yeah, I agree with that 100%, and I've certainly been guilty of that in the past as well. Like if I'm not communicating during the course of the execution of their exercise, then I'm not serving them. And in fact, it is usually a case of us over communicating. Doesn't mean we can't have a debrief afterwards or in between, and then have them go back and do it. It's the overcoaching during the action that really becomes the biggest problem, right? So if we're giving them a debrief afterwards, it's providing what's called knowledge of results, right? What they did good, what they did bad, some suggestions on how to correct. But at the end of the day, it's up to their system to find the solution, right? And if they can't find the solution, then it's up to us to coach it down into somewhat more of a regression to do that. But you're probably also speaking to the fact that we highlight too many muscles, right? We talk about too many individual muscles while we're doing things. And what I think is a really powerful metaphor that I often use with my clients is that muscle contractions can be like a volume knob, right? So 0 means it's completely flaccid, no electric activity. Essentially, the person's dead, right? So most of the stuff is never going to be on a 0. And a 10 would be maximum contraction, right? So as a volume knob, though, during the course of movement, that volume knob needs to dial up and down based on demands. If you tell somebody to squeeze their glute, which has become part of the everyday vernacular across the world, the odds are that volume knob is going to go up to a number and it's going to stay there, right? And if it stays there, it's not going through the relative engagement and changes within the tension that should be in that muscle, which ultimately also influences how the joint behaves. Compression to the joint, right, or the ability for other joints to execute, sort of do what they're supposed to do at the same time, because we put an emphasis on that. So the brilliance and the inherent intelligence of our motor system handles that dial for us, right? But if we're overcoaching something and consciously creating some kind of contraction during a multi-joint dynamic movement, it's definitely going to interfere with the natural reflexive dial up and dial down that our software is very capable of.
Oh, brilliant, love it. And that really leads me into the next piece I wanted you to speak to our listeners about. And that is, what is the difference between an internal focus and an external focus and with respect to movement?
Yeah, it's really simple. Internal is within our bodies, right? So if everything that we're focusing on is in relationship to our body, that becomes an internal focus of attention. An external focus of attention is going to be something that's outside of our body, that can be a target or a reference point, sometimes a metaphor, sometimes a story that goes with it, but all of it will take the person's focus of attention and put it in an area that doesn't interfere with the body trying to figure it out. And so what the research has been really strong on is, especially on the sort of the athletic side, which is the more dynamic side of things, really strong on the external focus of attention. That doesn't mean internal focus of attention is something that should not happen. It's just it's a different application, and maybe certainly on the corrective, the rehab side of things. It could be something that we're doing with more remedial, isometric, quasi-isometric exercises that need to be done. But when that client's up and moving around in three-dimensional space with multiple joints and segments involved, then they're gonna do better, and we're gonna have to do better with our language and our cues that put them external to the body.
And so that ties into what another part of your presentation was talking about, intrinsic and extrinsic, basically focus. So same concept, right? So we're thinking about things around us versus things inside of us.
Yeah. The focus of attention is what you're thinking about, right? So as folks are listening to this right now and they're sitting down, maybe they're sitting down if they are, or even if they're standing up. If you're sitting down, you're probably not thinking about your butt cheeks right now, right? Because it's something that doesn't need a lot of attention. But if I bring it up and I say, hey, let's think about our butt cheeks, everybody's going to be on their butt cheeks right now. And there'll be a certain degree of focus that goes there, but that also occupies a certain amount of attention that takes away from other focus, right? So their ability to multitask and from a cognitive standpoint becomes challenged as well. So if I'm asking you to really squeeze your glutes or tighten your abs as you do this, that's not only is that a motor response, it's also a cognitive load, right? And so consider that with also the type of clientele you're working with. So if you're working with a senior, or you're working with somebody that just has poor kinesthetic awareness, or somebody that's post rehab, you're occupying resources when you do that at the same time, right? So there's a lot that goes into what we're probably not taking into consideration in the execution of the movement.
Love it, love it. And I see questions starting to fly in here, and I think we're hitting some really good. You are hitting some really good touch points, and maybe certainly opened my eyes, and I have a feeling we're seeing some of that right now. So considering what you've just talked to from a cognitive leak to rewiring of a movement and so forth. So what would be your tips or your to-dos for a coach, a trainer trying to explain somebody through a movement with the traditional intrinsic cueing that we're many of us are used to? Can you give some examples or some best practices of how they can use kind of an external focus or an extrinsic type of communication with them?
Yeah, well, number one, it's sometimes if you've been doing it with all an intrinsic focus, it's going to be challenging, right? And even when we try to, for my reading of the literature and my understanding, and therefore my application of it, there's also sometimes a bit of a hybrid, in that you're referencing a part of the body, but you're associating it with something that's external to the body, which is different than saying tighten your glutes, or you should feel it here, or make sure your shoulder blades are doing X, Y, or Z, whatever it is, right? So by thinking about an area for one thing. So you can give direction or distance or some of the things that we look at as external points of focus or focus of attention, you could say. And so if somebody's, where they're reaching with a certain way, or, imagine, so a hybrid would be when somebody says, make your spine long, right? So that's not saying I want you to feel your thoracic back extend or straighten. You're saying something that can make them think, or make your spine long so you feel like your head is trying to get to the top of the ceiling. Okay, so that gives them both an internal and external cue, and that's a nice little, for again, depending on the type of the exercise, how advanced is the movement. One of the slides I also have in my presentation is where I describe an inverse relationship, meaning that the more remedial the exercise is, the more appropriate an intrinsic focus of attention may be, especially for the new exerciser or in the corrective side of things. But as we start to go up into more multi-joint and dynamic exercises, then there starts to be a shift in where the external focus of attention should be. So you can describe where I want you to reach to, or imagine that you're, one of the ones that Nick Winkleman, who's really done a lot of research on this, talks about, and like with the athlete, just pushing the ground away from you when you're doing something, or, referencing the earth, or referencing an external object within the room, or different ways that we can do it. But as I said, it can be tough if the only thing that you've ever done. So don't get, as a coach, don't get frustrated with yourself. Just practice. And you'll see a difference. You can literally influence a person's movement by the words that you say, which is pretty powerful.
Absolutely. Great stuff. Again, listeners, great topic, and it's something we all do, right? And now I think what we're finding is, for those of you that maybe made a little bit of a leap into online training, right, or remote training, because of what we just went through, you're probably trying to find or finding it a little bit more challenging to be able to talk a client through a movement. So this is exactly, when I think about all of this advice and all of the research behind it and everything Anthony shared, it makes me think, well, if I was coaching somebody online, which I've done before, and it's definitely been more challenging, these are the types of things that are definitely going to be a game changer. Would you agree with that, Anthony? Is that something that where you see that if online training requires even a different level of communication?
That's literally was the motivation for that last webinar that I did, and why we did it. Cues matter, because choosing our words makes all difference. On a two-dimensional screen where we can't move around the person, they can't in a three-dimensional way view our examples, our ability to communicate. And if we can't communicate, not just in cueing but communication in general, it can lead to a lot of frustration to the person on the other end, right? Which ultimately impacts the outcome of what you're trying to do, which is help them and for them to get the benefits from the exercise of the movement. So the two-dimensional screen really changes the dynamics of your ability to provide what the end user needs to be able to execute the way you want them to.
Perfect. Now I'm gonna move us into questions, but before we do, you've referenced the webinar you did and the presentation you did that included slides. Can you tell the listeners where they can find that? Because I'm sure they're going to want to learn more.
Yeah, we actually hosted it up on my YouTube channel. So if they just search up Function First on YouTube, 2 words, and or my name, there's the full webinar which we recorded, which we did on Zoom, is up there with the slide presentations, and everything is on there. So, and it's no charge. It's up there for free.
Excellent. Yeah, and I would definitely suggest the listeners out there, that's a great opportunity to dive in a little bit deeper. Well, I thank you for all that, Anthony, and I do have some questions teed up here, so I want to make sure that we get to those. So let's see. Okay, this is a good question. Now, forgive me if I say the name wrong. I do that a lot, I think. But Wei asks a question. Thank you, Wei, for typing one up for us here. And he says, I have a question with gripping dumbbells, etc., when performing an exercise. Do you recommend a light grip in order to focus more on the muscle of intention, rather than gripping hard and taking away from the muscle of focus. For example, forearms being used instead of the chest or back muscle.
Well, the first thing I would kind of be interested in about that is what's the level of experience with the trainer, right? Or I'm sorry, the client or the person executing the exercise. Because, for example, one of the reasons why people grip hard is because of safety and fear that something's going to happen, right? So that also becomes a part of the process of just efficiency that does happen with motor learning over time. So cueing somebody to, and again, if we're going intrinsic, extrinsic focus, you know, you wouldn't be telling somebody to relax the hands as much as you might say, you know, keep the dumbbell light in your hand. So again, the phraseology is going to be different. But part of it, so I get his point, his question in terms of like feeling forearm fatigue before it hits the major muscle groups that are involved. But go a step back and ask, why do you think that person is gripping so tight in the first place? And part of it is going to be, I don't want to eat a dumbbell today, right? So we're holding on tight. And then again, and know that that's going to be a progression in their level of comfort and their efficiency in movement before you can even get them to that point. So that would be my comment on that.
Excellent. Well, thank you. And I'm gonna give an example on that just real quick. I bought a new motorcycle recently, and it's way more power than I should be sitting on top of. It's a dirt bike, and it has so much power that just very small movement on the throttle, you know, will pull the front tire up. And I have I call it the death grip. I have a death grip on that thing because I'm scared to death. And when I only ride for an hour. Although riding a motorcycle is, you know, physical, it's my forearm that's destroyed. And it's exactly what you're saying. It's anxiety, it's fear, it's safety.
Sure.
So I definitely can relate to that. Very good example.
Yeah, and great analogy.
Yeah, the death grip. That's what I get the DOMS with, the delayed onset muscle soreness with the next day. It's not my legs, it's my forearm. Thank you, Wei, for asking that question. Sammy asks, how can you lead your client to experiment or figure safe movement out without coaching exact modifications?
Well, that's an excellent point and question, because it's not that you're not supposed to coach it initially and demonstrate it and set the expectations of what you want. The problem is that we're not giving them the opportunity to figure it out themselves once we do that. So they're absolutely correct in that we do demonstrate. I will demonstrate the exercise for my client. I'll tell them what I want. After they've done it for a few times, I might say, here's what I want. This is an old John Wooden teaching cue, right? UCLA code. Here's what I want. Here's what you're doing. Here's what I want again, and show them, right? And that doesn't mean that we're interfering with them once they're doing the exercise. We absolutely need to demonstrate it. We need to, and periodically during the execution, we will give them those cues, those external focus of attention, especially if it's a dynamic exercise, give them those cues. But they do need to know what's expected of them, for sure. So please do that, absolutely.
Excellent. And on that note, if you haven't heard of John Wooden, he's written several books, and one of them is around one of his taglines that's absolutely appropriate to this, and that is, you haven't taught until they have learned. So many of us believe that we're teaching or demonstrating or saying or whatever it may be effectively, but if what we want to happen is not happening, it's probably on your end, because the reason they haven't learned is the way that you taught.
Right.
So,
and then we have to change our strategy, right?
Absolutely, great reference there. So thank you very much for that question, Sammy. Let's see. Oh, well, Kristen asks, and I think this is something we can both talk about just briefly. Kristen asks, are there past webinars available to view anywhere? So do you have education courses? You know, let's just expand that out a bit, as well as webinars that our listeners can get access to.
Well, if it's specific to the cueing, we just mentioned it's up on my personal YouTube channel. From an education standpoint, we do a lot. We have a website, Function First Ed, www.functionalfirsted.com, where we have the pain-free movement specialist curriculum is up there, which is also available through PT on the Net. We have lots of articles and videos. I actually regularly post corrective exercises on my YouTube channel too, with in-depth explanations, kind of movement and motor control explanations around them. I've been doing that for years. So on that side of things, there's a lot of free education up there, and those videos would also be on our blog. So we have we have an educational website, functionfirsted.com, and then my general business is functionfirst.com on that side of things.
Okay, so functionfirsted.com and functionfirst.com for the listeners out there, and the YouTube channel are going to be great ways to learn more and see more of what Anthony's doing and done and will be doing in the future. For a PTA Global standpoint, this webinar will be recorded. It will be available to you on the ptaglobal.com website under events and complimentary webinars, and all of the interviews that we've done are memorialized there. So you'll be able to find them there, as well as on the PTA Global YouTube. So I hope that answered your question, Chris, and thank you for asking it. Let's see. Oh, and Sammy came back and said, thank you, question answered. So excellent. That's always a bonus to know, because you kind of, walk away going, I hope I answered that question.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
Thank you, Sammy.
Exactly.
Thank you, Sammy. And Wei says the same thing. So excellent, excellent. Let's see. Yep. Kristen said we nailed it. Wei says, ooh, this is a business question, and this is a great one for you. What advice would you give to a seasoned trainer who has reached maximum capacity? That's a good problem to have, by the way, and wants to scale their business in order to have more financial freedom.
Well, good for him to have that mindset as well. Well, we know the analogy of trading time for money, which is a big part of what we do when we charge an hourly rate. So there's the obvious things are, how do I leverage myself, right? How can I duplicate myself or what's in my head? So if you're an independent trainer, one thing would be to start to get in, would be seeing multiple people at the same time, right? The small group model where you can charge less but see more people at the same time. Another would be would find people that from a business standpoint that want to work with you, but maybe your fees are higher, or you raise your fees purposefully so that you can hire another trainer who you mentor and tutor, and then therefore they work with people, and you get an override on what you charge. So you take the money, you pay the trainer. They're less experienced. They're not quite as in demand as you are, so you offer their services at a lower price. And me personally, it's been a combination of that. It's been a combination of developing products that I can serve our fitness community with, both educational products and speaking engagements and writings, and figuring all those different ways that you can do things. Speaking even on the community level would be ways that you could either earn money or generate more business that way as well.
Excellent. Great advice. Great advice. Thank you for that question, Wei. And another one just popped up that is spot on from, again, hopefully I get this right, Isadora. Lovely name, Isadora. Can you please give an example of cueing through a complex movement, avoiding, in other words, avoiding overwhelming them with cueing or information? Can you give an example?
Well, if it's a complex movement, and all this right now is in the context of mostly one-on-one stuff, right? I realize that the challenge in even small group, never mind group exercise, is a little bit different. So we're generally offering more generic cues. But if somebody were doing a complex movement, the first thing I would actually do would be break it down segmentally in how they do the movement, right? So if there's things going on with both the lower body and the upper body at the same time, I will have my clients demonstrate a certain level of competency first. Okay, and sometimes it's just one or two. Like, so if a lunge is involved, let's make sure. Okay, let me see you do this. Okay, now we're going to enter this. So we're gonna put it together piece by piece. But as I do that, and I'm visually demonstrating for them, I might say, you're going to sit into this. with this. So now I'm looking at the first piece, and now I have they understand that. Now I add another component, and then there'll be an external cue that goes along with that, and then and if there's a third piece to it, then there'll be another cue that goes like that, goes with that way. But if it's a complex movement, you can't offer a you can't in your mind, and your expectation of your client shouldn't be that I need to offer an external cue for all the aspects of the movement, right? Because there's going to be, let's call it assumptions, that certain things are going to happen the way we want them to happen in general. So if it involves a lunge, but that person doesn't get any dorsiflexion as they're doing something with the arms, right? They might show clear competency of what you want them to do with the arm, but now you've got to add a cue that kind of unlocks all the linkage, because you've got to put a little bit more emphasis on that segment. So basically, you've got to figure out where the cue is going to be most, where the most leverage you're going to get, the biggest bang for your buck with the right cue. And that might take a little bit of exploration, meaning as the client goes through the movement a few times, you'll figure out where the hiccup is in the movement, because some of it's going to be fine, some of it isn't going to be executed the way you want it to. So, that's where you're going to be looking in terms of, where do I need to see the most improvement in this? Where do I need to clean up this movement the most? And that's where my cue is going to go. And that can change, right? There might be a big rock initially that you're going to put your focus on, and then in terms of your coaching cues, and then you see that, okay, now they got that. Now I've got to move to this next cue that way. But don't get caught up in, I've got to ramble off 5 different external cues, focus of attention externally here as this person moves, because that's just going to backfire. It's going to backfire on me.
Good stuff. Good stuff. And Isadora, thank you again for your question. Hopefully that was helpful. It certainly was for me. And as much as I want to just wrap up now, there's one more question that
Great.
And I mean, you could speak to anything, Anthony, and it's so cool to have people asking questions here. But here's a good one, because you work with folks, a lot of folks, and you specialize in pain-free movement. So the question here is, I've been getting mixed answers. This is from Kim. Thank you, Kim. I've been getting mixed answers on step-ups for people with bad knees. Are they ideal for them, or are they contraindicative? I'm going to throw that word in.
I personally don't think any exercise is contraindicated if it unless it hurts somebody, right? So if a step up, for example, if a step up is an exercise that somebody needs because they live at home because they have stairs, then we could break down that question into, what's the level of the step up? Are they keeping their foot up and just moving there? Are they physically stepping up? So there's different ways that we can do it. There are certain contraindications post-op for certain people. There might be certain contraindications that you receive from a licensed medical professional that says stay away from that, and that's generally a limited window. So I'm very cautious to put a label of contraindicated on an exercise, period. For one client it may be, and for another client it may not be. And again, there's a whole lot of let's get a little bit more specific on what you mean, and how is that step up executed, and what's the underlying pathology that this client's been diagnosed with by a medical professional. If it hurts their knee when they do it, then don't do it. There's a lot of other ways that you can improve. You could even literally change that exercise by what you ask them to do with their trunk, right? And that completely changes the recruitment of the hip muscles, which then support the knee, right? So there's a lot to unpack when it comes to an answer like that. But the easy answer is, there's no absolute contraindications on an exercise like that.
Brilliant. And it takes us right back to when I used to bother Rodney Korn with a ton of questions every time I saw him, and his most common answer was, it depends, or I need more information. And I can remember how much that used to frustrate me, and now I know exactly what he was talking about. So thank you for that, Anthony. So I'm going to wrap things up now. We very, very grateful for everybody tuning in, staying tuned in. We mentioned a little bit about how to find more information from Anthony, Carey, from Function First. So functionfirsted.com, functionfirst.com. He also has a phenomenal product called the Cortex, which is I'm not even going to try to describe it because it's so difficult. I'm not going to use the right words, but it basically encourages variability and movement, which is what we do in life. Not everything has variability. Yep, reactive platform. There you go, the technical word. So Anthony, is there anything you want to add about where folks can learn from you, where they can, be educated by you, where they can, utilize your product and so forth?
Again, lots of complimentary stuff that's up on our on both our websites. People can take the Function First Ed. That's a membership site, but they can take it for a test drive, free 24 hours, and they can poke around and see if they like what's on there. That's also where they can access some of our the pain-free movement specialists. Another one that my director of education, Kevin Murray, has put together called the Yellow Brick Road, which is really kind of a psychology coaching based one. He's a counselor. He's got his graduate degree in counseling psychology. That's on there as well. CortexFitness.com, and that's spelled CORETEX Fitness.com. If they're interested in the product, but we also put up a lot of information around reactive training and the value that has. I just had an article come out that I wrote on that as well. And there's articles dated way back on PT on the Net that I have in your guys' resource there as well. And hopefully, when all this clears up, I'm going to get to see some of these folks at some of the conferences around the globe sooner than later.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for sharing so much with us, with our listeners, for being a part of PTA Global, going way back, and PT on the Net, going back, decades, dang near. For the listeners, again, we thank you for your time. You will receive an email after this with information, a little bit of a recap of where you can get more information from Anthony, as well as information.
And a discount. We'll have some discounts on our programs too. So that'll be in the email.
There you go. You definitely want to take advantage of that. So again, I thank you all very much. Anthony, thank you so much for spending time with us. And I'd like to actually just give you the opportunity, Anthony, to close us out.
Well, it's strange times that we're in. Even somebody listening to this from a year now, hopefully things will have changed in a lot of ways in the world for us for the better. I encourage everybody to go to work on themselves. We're all constantly, both physically, mentally, and spiritually, we're all constantly evolving and adapting to the circumstances around us. But if we're solid in how we're growing professionally, I think it's gonna better serve the industry. We know that there's a few black marks on the industry from people that whether it's their contribution is purely social media aesthetics that kind of bring us down a little bit and don't show the good that we do for people day to day. You have 300 followers, but you've literally changed the lives of the people that you've been working with for the last couple of years. To me, that's way more relevant than having 1 million followers and a six-pack. But the opportunity to continue to feed our minds and grow that way as individuals is really what's going to make the difference in our industry as we become, as I said at the beginning, as we become more a critical role in the well-being and public health. We need to be ready for that. And one last thing I just want to say, one of the most disappointing things that I ever hear from people in our field is when they say, well, I'm just a trainer. No, you're not. No, you're not. You are a life-changing professional. That's what you are. So elevate yourself and you will elevate those around you.
Words of wisdom. Thank you, Anthony. Thank you, listeners. Until next time.
Thank you, my friend.
Keep changing lives. Keep saving lives.
Amen.